Good evening. Thank you for coming out on this very hot evening for a wonderful presentation. If you're still looking for a seat, there are some rooms in the balconies up on either side. We're delighted to have a full house. My name is Deborah Haarsma. I am an astronomer and I am president of BioLogos, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. So tonight is the culmination of a series of talks that have happened over the last 2 years, sponsored by the Trinity Forum in partnership with Church of the Advent and with BioLogos. I'm president of BioLogos. That's the organization founded by Francis Collins, so I'm particularly delighted to be here tonight. We titled this series Discovery and Doxology. So discovery, scientific discoveries from the vast to the tiny. Things from the multiverse we've talked about in this series. We talked about genetics and am I more than my genes? We've talked about neuroscience and how our brains are wired. But it's been about more than discovery. Also doxology. How do we understand this in the context of our faith? Science is limited. It can tell us the what and the how, but we need more than science to understand the why and the who. How does it relate to who we are? How does it relate to God? And that's what this series has been about. We've talked about our origins in this cosmos. We've talked about what it means to be human in light of genetics, the soul, and neuroscience. Just a few little topics like that. And it's been an amazing conversation. So we're pleased tonight to bring the last in this series here. In Christian thought, discovery quickly leads to doxology or praise. Last week I was in Chicago and I had the privilege of spending an afternoon at the Art Institute and going around looking at those amazing paintings. I wished sometimes that I had a chance to meet the artists and to thank them for their work. Well, in science, we're discovering the work of an artist, and we have an opportunity to speak to the living God in prayer and to praise him and thank him for his work. And that is the wonderful place where discovery and doxology comes together for me as a Christian and an astronomer. If you don't get enough tonight and in this series about science and faith, there's several events coming up. I just want to highlight one from BioLogos. Next March, we are having a 3-day-long conference. If you like it so much that you'd like to spend 3 days thinking about science and Christian faith, I encourage you to join us in Baltimore and just sign up at our table there if you'd like to be on our email list to get information about that. It's been a pleasure in this series for BioLogos to partner with the Trinity Forum, so I am pleased to introduce the president of the Trinity Forum, Cherie Harder. Please welcome.
Thank you, Deb, for that introduction. And on behalf of all of us at the Trinity Forum, welcome to tonight's evening conversation on moving beyond conflict, science and faith in harmony. It's a real pleasure to be able to welcome you all to tonight, as well as to work with our partners, with Deb Haarsma at BioLogos, as well as the folks from Church of the Advent. We're really delighted that Deborah Tepley and Dan and Jen Bielman from Church of the Advent are here, as well as Deb, who you just met. We're deeply grateful to the Templeton Religion Trust for their role in underwriting this series. It's been a very generous grant. We've been really delighted to be able to bring this series to you. And as Deb mentioned, tonight is the fruition of a 2-year initiative where we have looked at questions of the multiverse. We've looked at genes, self, and soul. We've struggled with questions about mind, matter, and our maker. And tonight, not to put too much pressure on him, our speaker is going to bring it all home and look at not only what it means for science and faith to be in harmony, but also what some of the applications and the consequences of that could mean going forward. I also want to acknowledge a few special guests that we have here tonight, in addition to our partners, Church of the Advent and BioLogos. Also delighted that our chairman of the board, Price Harding, is here, along with some of his guests, and trustees Richard and Phoebe Miles are here as well. We're also delighted that each and every one of you is here. And as you can tell, it is a very full room, and there are always inevitably people who wanted to come who could not. So if you know people like that, fear not, there is an opportunity to follow along with our live stream going on as the name indicates, live now, which you can channel through our Facebook site. It'll also be on our website later, likely on the websites of BioLogos as well. We'll also be offering some opportunities to tweet your thoughts and responses. You can follow along on Twitter as well as our Facebook page. For those of you who are new to the Trinity Forum, part of our mission is to provide a space and resources for leaders to grapple with life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And one of the great questions of life is the proper relationship between the claims of science and of faith, in our quest to understand who we are, how we're formed, and what we're formed for. Certainly, we live in an exciting time of scientific discovery. Every day, we learn more about the extraordinary complexity of the makeup of our minds and bodies, about the ways in which they interact, the ways in which they change and are changed by experience. Many of these new discoveries can be unsettling as well as exciting, challenging long-held conceptions about our own rationality, autonomy, memory, free will, and even self-identity. We also live at a time when the findings of science and the doctrines of Orthodox Christian faith are often believed to be in conflict. New discoveries about our genes, our brains, or our origins have at times been interpreted in the most reductionistic of ways and trumpeted as proving that we are, at our essence, spiritless and of little matter, a mere circuit of hardwired neurons, or a gaggle of selfish genes, lost in a vast and meaningless cosmos, bereft of any meaning we do not ourselves construct via our own dubious imagination. Meanwhile, there are people of faith who fear that scientific discovery is somehow undermining of spiritual truth or Christian orthodoxy and requires rebuttal rather than pursuit. For others, the very real and valid concerns about the uncritical acceptance, even celebration, of new technological applications leads to a reflexive suspicion of the whole enterprise. But part of our hope for this series over the last 2 years is to offer and explore a different hypothesis, that science and faith actually have a great deal to say to each other and to us, enabling us to better understand ourselves, our minds, our world, and its originator and designer, and that contemplating the complexity of our cosmos and the mystery of our self and soul may in fact cultivate a new sense of wonder, awe, and even worship, a doxology amidst discovery. So tonight, we'll hear from a geneticist and a philosopher about the prospect of science and faith moving beyond an assumed conflict to live in harmony, what that means, what it signifies for our own understanding of our genes, self, soul, and world, and why it matters so much. And it is hard, perhaps even impossible, to imagine a thinker and a speaker who could wrestle with this topic with more gravitas and grace, extraordinary expertise and infectious enthusiasm, wisdom and wonder, as our speaker tonight, Dr. Francis Collins. Francis Collins is a geneticist, physician, and the director of the National Institutes of Health. Before being appointed by then President Obama to serve as the head of NIH, a term that was later extended by President Trump, he led the International Human Genome Project, which mapped the entire human genome, and did so, perhaps even more miraculously, under time and under budget. His work with the Human Genome Project, which provides, in essence, a human DNA instruction book, led to the discovery of the connection between certain genes and various diseases and helped revolutionize our own understanding of our genetic makeup. Dr. Collins has been elected to the Institute of Medicine, the National Academy of Sciences, and received the Presidential Medal of Freedom as well as the National Medal of Science. In addition, in 2009, he was appointed by the Pope to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. Before serving as the director of the NIH, Francis founded and served as the president of the BioLogos Foundation, our partners tonight, and wrote a number of books on science, medicine, and religion, including the New York Times bestseller, The Language of God. He's also an avid motorcyclist, guitarist, and vocalist who has delighted in playing in rock bands and has performed at TED conferences. And we're delighted that his wife, the accomplished Diane Baker, has joined us this evening as well. Responding to Francis will be philosopher James K.A. Smith. Jamie is a philosopher as well as a professor at Calvin College, where he holds the Gary and Henrietta Biker Chair in Applied Reformed Theology and Worldview. He is the award-winning author of Who's Afraid of Postmodernism, Desiring the Kingdom, the excellent work You Are What You Love, The Spiritual Power of Habit, as well as his latest, perhaps greatest book, Awaiting the Kingdom, Reforming Public Theology, which was released late last year and which we had the honor of hosting him in this very room to discuss. He's also the co-editor of 2 recent books on the intersection of faith and science, including Evolution and the Fall and All Things Hold Together in Christ, a conversation on faith, science, and virtue. His popular writing has appeared in publications such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Books and Culture, First Things, and many other publications. In addition, he is a senior fellow of Cardis, serves as the editor of Comet Magazine, and last but certainly not least, is a senior fellow of the Trinity Forum. After Francis and Jamie's presentations, we'll have an opportunity for extended audience Q&A. And with that, Francis, welcome.
Sheree, you do that about as well as anybody on the planet, may I say. What a wonderful introduction. And what a great opportunity it is to be here this evening, sponsored by BioLogos and the Trinity Forum. And Deb Harzma, as the president of the BioLogos, thank you also for coming from Grand Rapids for this and gracing us with your words and your presence. And thanks also to the Church of the Advent for sponsoring this discussion, which I've been really looking forward to. And I have to tell you, I am here this evening as a private citizen. This is an important statement for me to make. Yes, I am a member of the federal government, currently appointed by President Trump, prior to that by President Obama. But tonight, I'm just Francis Collins, so glad to get that clarified. And this whole theme that we're here to talk about in this, which is a series that has been going on, which I've had the privilege of listening to several of the other presentations, so much appeals to me, the idea of discovery and doxology. In trying to think about what I might contribute to that, I've divided what I'm going to say up into 2 segments. And one is a bit more autobiographical because I thought it might be useful to point out to you the perspective that I've arrived at as a scientist and as a follower of Jesus. And then I'm going to put in front of you the second part of this talk. The first part looks like it's all going to be really easy. The second part, how should believers view advances in biotechnology? Because it seems like an appropriate moment where things are happening, particularly in a field called gene editing, that a gathering like this would be an appropriate one to talk about. How do we feel about the opportunity to actually reinvent ourselves? Is this something we can embrace because it has great potential in medicine, or is it something we should think a little more deeply about before we plunge in? And I hope we can get engaged in a discussion. So that's the nature of what I want to put in front of you. With that, let me start with the autobiographical part, perhaps a bit more revealing than I should be. Yes, that's me on the farm that I grew up on, which was about 3 hours from here in the Shenandoah Valley. And I grew up in a family that cared about theater and that cared about words and music, didn't have much use for science, and certainly didn't have much use for faith. I, as that kid that you see there standing by the fence, got interested in science a little later, got interested in music, thought maybe I'd be a musician, discovered that was not going to be the way to pay the bills, and so decided I would be a chemist. And off I went to the University of Virginia, where I got an undergraduate degree in chemistry, really enjoyed the experience of plunging into that branch of science, went off to Yale to get a PhD in quantum mechanics. But along the way, I realized I'd kind of left out a part of my scientific education, which was actually biology. That seemed really messy, and I tried to avoid it as long as I could. But something happened. I realized, actually, biology has principles too, and it actually makes sense when you know about this molecule. which I only really discovered long after everybody else had in about 1972. As a second-year graduate student in quantum mechanics, DNA emerged in my vision as something of incredible mystery and promise and elegance, this information molecule that's shared by all living things. It's digital, but it's also an instruction book, and I wanted to change whatever I was doing and study that. But I wasn't quite sure how to do so, and being a little unsure of myself at that point, I decided it would be good to keep my options open. So I went to medical school. Does that make sense? Well, had I had any interest in being a physician before then? Only a very minor degree, but suddenly it seemed like the thing to do. And it was, and I loved it going there. Now I will tell you, when I arrived in medical school, after studying quantum mechanics and reducing everything to second-order differential equations and being a very reductionist kind of person, I had gone from being an agnostic to becoming an atheist. And I was an atheist when I arrived in that medical school. But I left that medical school as a believer. So how did that happen? Well, it happened by sitting at the bedside of people who were facing the end of their life and trying to understand how they would wrestle with that kind of circumstance when I had no idea how I would, and realizing that my arguments about the irrationality of faith were those of a schoolboy. And fortunately for me, a Methodist preacher who lived down the street from me, faced with my questions about how could people possibly believe in something like God, much less Jesus, he handed me this little book called Mere Christianity. And C.S. Lewis spoke to me from his own experience, which had been kind of like my experience, and kicking and screaming over 2 years, wanting to prove that my atheism was the right answer, and ultimately realizing that, as Chesterton said, atheism is the most drastic of all the dogmas because it is the one you can least defend. I became a believer, and not just a believer in God, but ultimately seeking a way to find a relationship with a holy God when I knew I was not, discovered what Jesus Christ was all about. So that was quite a bit of a change in this guy who was on his path towards studying that DNA molecule and wanted to be a geneticist, and people said, well, your head's going to explode. But it never has. Still here. I went back to Yale to do a fellowship, this time in human molecular genetics. Learned how to do those recombinant DNA things to try to track down the causes of various genetic disorders that desperately needed answers. I got a job finally at the University of Michigan where I was a gene hunter trying to identify the causes of genetic illnesses. It was tough going. This was the 1980s. There was no genome project. There was no internet. What you had to do to sift through 3 billion letters of the human DNA code and find the one that's out of place was absolutely exhausting and miserable and took years. I had to go to a Michigan haystack and get somebody to take a picture of me holding up a needle to say just how bad this was. And yeah, that's a real chicken in the picture too. So. But fortunately, it finally started to work. And in 1989, my lab, working with the lab in Canada as a wide-open collaboration, found the gene for cystic fibrosis. We found the genes for Huntington's disease, for neurofibromatosis, and other common childhood disorder. And more recently, for the most common and most frightening form of premature aging, Hutchinson-Gilford progeria syndrome. All of those have been amazing detective stories, and I have been greatly fortunate to work with other amazing trainees and other colleagues to be able to make those kinds of discoveries and then to carry them forward to the idea of treatment. Cystic fibrosis, which when we found that gene in 1989, was a disease where survival generally was limited to your 20s, and that was a big progress from where it had been a few decades earlier. Just in the last 2 or 3 years, we've now seen the development of truly effective drugs based on understanding all the pathways that are revealed when you know what the genetic mutation is. And this is an enormously exciting moment for cystic fibrosis, where most individuals with that condition are now going to have the kind of therapy that essentially makes their lungs start to behave like they were normal lungs again. And that is so gratifying. And to be part of that, to have a chance to play a role in that kind of adventure, that has just been amazing. But then I got this call from the NIH. It was 1992, and I'd really gotten excited about the idea that maybe we could read out all those letters of the Human DNA Instruction Book. The Genome Project had gotten brought forward as an idea It had just gotten off the ground. The leader, Jim Watson, of Watson and Crick fame, was the exact right person to have credibility for this. But then he got tangled up in a bit of an argument with his boss, and suddenly he was gone. And suddenly the phone was ringing, and the NIH director at the time, Bernadine Healy, was saying, "Francis, I think you're the one." And I was saying, "Bernadine, you're wrong. I'm sure that's not me. The one thing my mother told me never to do is to become a federal employee." But I was going to say no to the chance to lead the most significant project that's ever happened in human biology. Well, that got harder and harder to defend. And so I did come in 1993. And over the course of the next amazing 10 years, we did, in fact, read out all of the letters of that human DNA instruction book, bit by bit, building the technology as we went along, studying some simpler organisms to get practice. And ultimately, by 2003, there it was. That is a milestone that people will write about in a few hundred years, where we crossed a bridge from not knowing about our own biological instruction book to having it there for all time. And that was exhilarating, but it was also daunting because, well, what are you looking at then? You're looking at this 3 billion letter book that's written in a language you can't understand. Just 4 letters, A, C, G, and T, 3 billion of them, that's it. Yeah, but how do you read this? How do you make sense out of it? So I stayed on for a while and tried to figure out how we could apply this, because I'm a physician, to the application that we all dreamed of, which is to help people who are ill or to help people not get ill in the first place. And that took then a whole lot of other projects, which then emerged as follow-ons and continue to emerge to the point where we are beginning to know how to read that instruction book. And the consequences of what we have learned for human illness is getting more breathtaking by the day, especially in areas like cancer, in areas like inherited diseases. Many of the things that seemed out of reach are now the kinds of things a graduate student could do in a month or two. It's really quite amazing and gratifying how this course of events has led us to all these insights. And for me, as a believer, as well as a scientist, every time we discover something new, that is a moment of doxology. That is a moment of seeing the artist, as Deb so articulately said. And when we get to glimpse the work of the Creator for the first time, that makes science also a form of worship. And it does feel that way to those of us who are believers. We are not just detective people who are trying to uncover answers to questions. We are also exploring God's creation and learning about it and its elegance in a way that increases our awe day by day. I got called back to NIH after taking a year off in 2009 to serve not just as the leader of the genome effort, but of the entire National Institutes of Health, something that I certainly never dreamed of. Remember that kid on the farm standing by the fence? It's come a long way. And yeah, I did have to apologize to my mom. This is the one time I disobeyed her. And yeah, here I am again as a federal employee. And astounding to me, still as the NIH director, since there has no previous example occurred where an NIH director stayed on when there was a change in presidents. But I think what that says is that medical research is one of the last bastions of bipartisanship in this very partisan town. And I'm the beneficiary of that. And I spent a lot of my time on Capitol Hill talking about medical research. I've probably met with hundreds of members of Congress one-on-one to talk about this, and I can't tell you a single one of those conversations that went badly. And that's not because I'm so articulate and wonderful. It's because what we're doing, what we have the chance to talk about is so exciting. It's so inspiring to see the progress that's happening, which is really coming along now in an exponential way. Whether it's cancer or whether it's Alzheimer's disease, which is what I was talking about this morning, whether it's coming up with an answer to this opioid crisis, which is what I spent most of the rest of my day on today, or whether it's figuring out what we could do to develop a vaccine against influenza that would protect us against that next pandemic that's looming out there somewhere, or whether it is, as I'm about to talk about, coming up with ways to manage the terrible consequences of those thousands of genetic diseases where we know what the misspelling is, but we don't yet have a way to treat it. All of that is what's possible right now, and that is incredibly exhilarating to be part of. But there is this issue about how do I, as a scientist who thinks every day about the ways that we could utilize the tools of science to make those discoveries, how can I also see behind all of that a creator God who is in fact responsible for everything we see around us, and who's the source not only of natural creation, but also the source of everything that I know about love. I love this combination of images here. What you're looking at there on the right is DNA, but not in the usual fashion where you're looking at it from the side. Here you're looking down the long axis of DNA, and it turns into this beautiful pattern, which is not all that different than that rose window that you see there in York Minster, or that you might see if you go to the National Cathedral. I think that is a visual way to point out the beauty of what it is that God has given us as a creation. And we ought not to miss that, even as we get excited about its practical consequences. Science also has a chance to uncover beautiful things, and we have that experience and sometimes don't stop to take note. But people do ask me, and so for a very quick riff, I will give you my own quick pathway about how it is that I went from being an atheist to concluding that atheism was the least rational of the choices. Part of it is actually from nature. I'm not going to tell you that nature will provide you a proof of God's existence, but it will sure provide you some interesting things to think about. Starting with the classic philosophical question, why is there something instead of nothing? Science can't answer that, all right? So this has to be an answer that comes from somewhere else. And if you're going to be an absolute reductionist and a materialist, you will say that's an irrational question and we shouldn't bother with it. But I think it's a pretty interesting question. And here theology can help you and science can't. Another one, this is Wigner's words, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Why should Maxwell's equations describe the behavior of electromagnetism? Beautiful that they are, and they are beautiful equations. They're not just equations, they're beautiful equations. Why should gravity follow an inverse square law? There's no reason I can think why that should have to be, but it is. Nature is incredibly ordered. It follows these mathematical rules. That's unreasonable. That makes you think about some intelligence that must have been an amazing physicist and mathematician that put this whole thing in place. How else could you explain that outcome? And then we have the Big Bang. How can you explain the idea that the universe seemed to have a beginning? This does seem to cry out for something that would have created that beginning that could not be limited by space and time, or you've created an infinite regress and you've not solved the issue. A creator outside of space and time. Wow, that sounds like God, doesn't it? And then you have this observation, which I still think many Christians have not heard about, sometimes called the anthropic principle, that there are all these physical constants that determine the behavior of matter and energy. We know about these beautiful laws that describe that, but they have constants in them, the speed of light, the gravitational constant. You cannot derive the value of those constants from theory. You have to actually do an experiment and measure them. So people ask, suppose they weren't what they are. Suppose they were tweaked just a little bit. And what takes your breath away is that any one of those dozen or so constants were off by the tiniest amount, 1 part in a billion. The whole thing wouldn't work anymore. You could have a Big Bang, but after that you would have infinite either spreading apart of particles that never had the chance to come together into galaxies and stars, or a big crunch that happened not long afterwards without much hope of the time for anything interesting to happen. Complexity of our universe only happens because of this extreme improbability of the way in which the dials were set. So certainly one can revert to the multiverse hypothesis, and that was something that was talked about at this very podium, and Deb is much more expert on this than I am. But you have to argue, either there's a multitude, an infinite multitude of universes that all have different values, and we have to be in the one where complexity happened, or we wouldn't be having the conversation. Or you have to say, there's an intelligence behind this, and those constants were set in a particular place for a reason. Which of those is a greater leap, is a question. What would Occam's razor have to say about that? And then finally, and very appealing, but one which we have to be careful not to overstate, there is this notion of good and evil, the moral law. C.S. Lewis got me on this one in Mere Christianity in that very first chapter, Right and Wrong, as a clue to the meaning of the universe. That's the title of chapter 1. It's like, whoa, that sounds pretty heavy. What's that about? Well, it is this argument. Why is it that humans across all time have had this sense that there's such a thing as right and wrong? We, as cultures, figure out ways to decide which goes into which column of right and which column is wrong, but we don't disagree that there is such a thing. If you don't believe me, go and read the appendix of The Abolition of Man, where Lewis goes through all of the many long historical examples where that is the case. But what's that about? Why should that matter? And does the moral law, which we now call this, basically make sense from a purely evolutionary perspective? Well, in some ways, yes. In other ways, no. How does that explain the behavior of people who exhibit radical altruism, which basically causes them to do things that put their own life and therefore their future generations at risk, which evolution cares about your future generations, and yet it is the right thing to do? Why do we admire Oskar Schindler? Why do we admire Mother Teresa? Why do we admire people like that who put their own life as secondary compared to others? That seems like something that's calling out to us to think about, and perhaps once we think about it, to say, where's that coming from? If you were looking for a signpost, for something outside of ourselves, a creator who not only was a pretty good intellect and had a great sense of physics and how to set these constants, but who also cared about us and who stood for everything that was good and holy, wouldn't this be an interesting place to find that evidence right in your own heart, calling you every day to be good and holy, when many other things are asking you to do otherwise, and yet you somehow know what is the right choice, even though, as we all know, we fail to live up to it. That's what got to me back there in North Carolina as a medical student and a resident. That's what also got me to the point of realizing if that was the case, then my heart is hardened, and my heart is often leading me to do the wrong thing, even though I know that that's not right. And I need somehow to be able to approach a holy God. And then the argument about Jesus Christ suddenly made perfect sense. All those things about how Christ died for my sins, which as a kid growing up hearing those words, I thought were the most bizarre kind of phrasing I'd ever heard. Suddenly, the rationale was crystal clear. And it's crystal clear today. And this is now 40 years later. And I've never encountered, as a scientist, an experience where what I know as a scientist is in conflict with what I know as a believer and as somebody who looks at the words in the Bible as God's truth. Because faith and science are two ways of knowing, but they are ways of knowing. You have to decide which question you're asking before you decide which of these approaches is the one that's going to help you. Science answers how questions. Faith answers why questions. That's an oversimplification, but it's not a bad one. So we're allowed, as people on this planet, to read both of the books. And this is Francis Bacon's analogy, but I like it a lot. The book of God's words, Scripture, and the book of God's works, nature. And both of those, since they are God's books, can't very well be in conflict with each other. We humans, on the other hand, are very good at figuring out ways to identify conflicts, most of which, when you look at them closely, are of our own making. And certainly, although I'm not going to get into the ways in which evolution and Genesis 1 can be put together, there are, in fact, wonderful ways to do that through what BioLogos calls evolutionary creation. But we people have managed to turn this into a problem, especially in the United States. We can make fun of it with cartoons like this, which I actually think is really funny. The never-ending debate between cheddar and evangelical goldfish crackers. Yes, we came from cheese. We just appeared in the bag. You've heard conversations like that aren't quite this silly, but sometimes they don't get very far. There are ways, folks, to resolve these issues that are intensely satisfying, which many of us who are scientists and believers, particularly working in biology, I have found to be wonderfully satisfying. And that's what I wrote about in this book that was graciously mentioned, which is now getting a little old and desperately needs a second edition. And if I ever get free of this government job, I might actually write one. But here's the simple synthesis of how science and faith fit together for somebody like me, just quickly through it. Almighty God, who's not limited in space or time, created a universe 13.8 billion years ago with its parameters precisely tuned to allow the development of complexity and beauty over long periods of time. God's original plan, not added after the fact, included the mechanism of evolution to create the marvelous diversity of living things on our planet. Most especially, that creative plan included human beings. After God's plan for evolution, in the fullness of time, billions of years, had prepared a sufficiently advanced brain, humanity was gifted with free will, consciousness, and a moral sense. And thus humans were granted special status, as it says in Genesis, made in God's image, imago Dei. We humans, having been granted that opportunity, used our free will to disobey God, leading to our realization of being in violation of the moral law, as I realized as a medical student. And then we were estranged from God, our Creator, who embodies all that is good, loving, and holy. For Christians like me, Jesus Christ is the solution to that estrangement. Now, nothing that I've said in those few brief sentences seems to me to be a violation of what the Bible teaches us about origins or what science teaches us about origins, but we could have a long discussion about different views in that regard. If St. Augustine was here, I think he would agree with me. I'm just saying. So what do we call this synthesis? Well, that was a challenge because for a long time this was called theistic evolution, and people hated that term, as I did, because it made theistic the adjective and evolution was the noun, and everybody wondered, wait a minute, what are you sort of smuggling in here? So a word got invented, I guess by me, bios, that is life, through logos. The word, or just put it all together, BioLogos, as an alternative to using terms that people were not so happy with. And basically, God speaking life into being. That's what we mean. I think the alternative that is now used by many people, evolutionary creation, I like that a lot. Now, creation is the noun, evolutionary is the adjective. That also says, but it's BioLogos. And I was fortunate, before coming to this presidential appointment position, to serve as the founder and the first president of the BioLogos Foundation, now just called BioLogos. This is a screenshot from their website. I hope if you have not been there, you will find a way to go and look tonight or tomorrow, biologos.org. It is a wonderful meeting place for people who are interested in serious dialogue and civil dialogue about science and faith and how they fit together, particularly in the area of biology. And it has grown over the course of these years, and now under Deb's very able leadership, to be the place where many of those conversations happen, with remarkable contributions from many people who write blogs for us from various perspectives, from science, from philosophy, from theology. Pastors write in to talk about how this is affecting their flock. People write in testimonials about how, in a crisis of faith, and I get many of those emails even now from people who are figuring that something is really wrong here with the ability that they had to put together creation and what science is teaching us, and BioLogos provides them with an opportunity to work that through and see that there's a harmony here. This is not a cause for a personal crisis. BioLogos recently put forward, through a couple of the staff leadership, a wonderful book about testimonials, about people who came to realize that evolution could be not just something to apologize for, but something to celebrate as God's means of creation. And there are many of these blogs, and here, by way of opening up the second part of what I'm going to say, is a very recent one by none other than Jeff Harden, the chair of the board, writing about genome editing and the Christian, and very ably putting forward some of the very points that I thought I might bring to you tonight. So let's go to that second part. Now that I've put forward what I hope you will see as a foundation of where I'm coming from, how do we apply those kinds of harmonious thoughts to a circumstance where believers and non-believers may come down in a somewhat different place about applications about biotechnology, particularly when it comes to what it means to be human and who we are as creatures fearfully and wonderfully made, as opposed to a more reductionist view of what humanity is all about. There are lots of ethical challenges in biotechnology. The privacy of human DNA databases, animal research, especially non-human primates. We've recently decided not to do research on chimpanzees anymore. neuroethics, which was talked about from this very podium by Bill Newsom, one of the co-leaders of the Brain Initiative at NIH, creating many interesting issues about what we should be doing as we begin to understand how the brain really works, what those circuits are up to. Human embryonic stem cell research, obviously one that raises questions about the meaning of when human life begins. Human-animal chimeras, ugh, are we doing that? Well, not so much, but there are people who want to. If you want to make your own new heart, well, grow it in a pig. Oops, wait a minute, that's a human-animal chimera. Is that okay? Questions of that sort will emerge. Dramatic life extension. If we had the ability to help you all live to be 500 years old, is that okay? Do you want that? Probably you want to know what kind of life that would be as far as quality. But are we getting outside of what God's intention was? But I'm not going to focus on any of those. I'm going to go to gene editing because otherwise we'll be here very, very late. And Jamie will never get up and say the really important part of the evening. So gene editing, what am I talking about? There is a revolution going on, folks, and it came really quickly. And it's driven by this amazing science that came out of yogurt, of all places, and the study of viruses that infect bacteria. And it led to something called CRISPR-Cas9. And I'm not going to tell you what CRISPR stands for because I can't remember, and nobody else can either. But it is basically a gene editor. It is, I mean, you have your search and replace function on your word processor. That's what this is like, except what it's searching and replacing is a genome of a cell. It can find that one letter that's out of place, and it can fix it. So it is achieving this kind of precise, targeted editing of DNA that we didn't know how to do before. We could do this, but it was really clunky, and it took forever, and it was full of errors. This is a quantum leap forward in our ability to manipulate DNA. And not just of bacteria, and not just of mice, but ultimately of ourselves. It's revolutionized basic molecular biology. Every lab I know of, including my own up there at NIH, is doing this every day. It's easy. The first time you set it up, it works. And the applications to human genetic disease are now being actively explored because this is a potential for those thousands of genetic diseases to have a solution. This is one of my tweets. I'm sure you are all following my Twitter feed. I'm sure you're part of my 89.1 thousand people. But this, back in January, we at NIH announced we were going to invest another $190 million and try to figure out how we could take gene editing to actually attack some of these genetic diseases for which there is no solution. But we said we were going to do it in somatic cells. Let me explain that, because that's really important as we get into the ethical issues. Now, there's a lot of promise here. Welcome to the golden age of human gene editing. You can see things in the New England Journal about we're doing this for important issues like cancer or HIV. There's already been a circumstance where this apparatus, CRISPR-Cas, has been infused into a patient with a genetic disease. And it's coming along every day in that regard. But wait a minute, is there peril here as well? Well, Albert Schweitzer's quote comes to mind: "We must not allow our technology to exceed our humanity." And here's some scarier headlines: designer babies, an ethical horror? Whoa. Or a weapon of mass destruction? What are they talking about? Well, they're talking about what might happen if we take this enormously powerful technology and we actually begin to edit not just a cell here and there in your body, but the part of the genome that gets passed from one generation to the next, that we really start to redesign ourselves. Now, it's not new to have these controversies about whether biotechnology is playing God. Goodness, back in the 1970s, back when I was just getting interested in this stuff, one of the reasons was because recombinant DNA was being invented. And in a certain way, what we're talking about with CRISPR-Cas is just recombinant DNA. But what's different is it's really good at it. And we were so clumsy back then, but people still got worked up about the consequences. Maybe that's good because we had a little time to think about it. Genetic engineering, well, that's really recombinant DNA too. So we're talking about the same issues. Cloning, well, some of the things that are now possible with stem cells make the kind of cloning that we talked about in the 90s also seem kind of clunky, and we didn't resolve that. Yeah, the Human Genome Project had some controversies too about whether privacy was going to be available for your DNA, where you're going to be discriminated against. synthetic biology, where you actually don't just read DNA, you write it. Maybe you write an entire genome. Maybe you write a human cell from scratch. What does that mean about what it means to have a human cell? And now we're with genome editing, and you could even talk about people who want to do it yourself, because it is easy. And people say, well, any high school student can do this. It's not quite that easy. I don't think there are too many garages that are doing CRISPR-Cas, but there might be a few. And there might be more, because it does provide some opportunities there. So are we ready to play God? And you can see the Sistine Chapel is always brought to bear on these questions, and this time with a double helix inserted between the creator and the created. So we've had those discussions. That's good. We shouldn't go, oh my gosh, why didn't we think about it? We have been thinking about it, but it was kind of hypothetical. The Catholic Church is thinking about this. The fourth annual Vatican Conference was on gene editing as well as some stem cell therapy. This was just less than 2 months ago. A bunch of us went to this conversation because the Pope and the cardinals really wanted to hear about what does the science have to offer. I think the Catholic Church was concerned that they're often portrayed as standing in front of the oncoming science and saying, stop, as opposed to, wait a minute, let's understand this. So it was a really good opportunity for those kind of conversations. We heard from Pope Francis. Some other guy named Francis got an award. Sitting between a couple of cardinals, oh my gosh. But it was a useful dialogue. Indeed, it was a good example of science and the church talking to each other, not shouting, talking to each other. So let me say, what are the applications and why are we worried about this? And I need to move this quickly forward. Again, I'm worried about taking Jamie's time here. So human gene editing, you can divide into 2 categories, one of which, somatic cell gene editing, is focused on a particular organ. It doesn't affect the germline. The germline is the part of the DNA that gets passed to the next generation and the one afterward. So it doesn't have any consequence except for that person. It holds the promise to cure many genetic diseases. I'll give you an example in a second. Already being used for cancer immunotherapy, where you take out immune cells, you edit them to turn them into little ninja warriors, and then you turn them loose to go back and attack that cancer. And people are alive today because of that, which is remarkable. And it doesn't seem to create ethical dilemmas in that situation. It's a form of therapy. Clinical trials for a human genetic disease, sickle cell anemia, will begin this year. And this is something that many of us are enormously excited about. Here, this is the first molecular disease described in 1910. 1949, we knew the inheritance. 1957, we knew the genetic basis. Hemoglobin genes, which are involved in this, were identified in 1980. There is a drug, hydroxyurea, but it is not as effective as you would like. And there are 100,000 people, African Americans for the most part, in this country, and millions more outside of this country, that are affected with this condition without really much in the way of an effective treatment. Bone marrow transplants work, but most patients don't have a match. Just last year, people began to approach this with gene therapy, but this year, before this calendar year is out, will be the year where the first gene editing strategy is tried for sickle cell disease, and I am pretty optimistic it's going to work. So how do you do this? The problem is in the blood cells. The blood cells are made in the bone marrow. Take out some bone marrow. Identify those bone marrow stem cells, which we can sort for. Use CRISPR-Cas to take that single letter that should be a T and it's an A, and change that back to what it should be. Put them back in the bone marrow, and there you go. There's a few wrinkles along the way, but that's the basic idea. And again, I think this will be the first year where that gets tried, and I think the chances are pretty good it's going to work. Now, that's sickle cell disease. What about others? Well, look at the number of diseases for which we now know the precise DNA mutation that causes the disease. How many of these have a treatment? 500. If we really want to find answers for these, most of which are rare and they're not going to attract much private investment, this could be the way to have an approach that's scalable, that you could, once you've worked it out, figure out how to treat many of these. Now, it's not as straightforward as sickle cell disease, where you can take cells out, treat them, and put them back. If it's a genetic disease that affects the brain, you're going to have to figure out how to deliver that CRISPR-Cas apparatus to the brain efficiently, and that's a big, hard problem And that's what we're spending our $190 million on right now. But the promise here is enormously appealing. So this all sounds great. Okay, and then there's the other part, germline gene editing. This does involve changing the DNA of a human embryo. It therefore affects that individual and their future offspring too. Medical applications are actually, to be honest, hard to identify. But the potential to go beyond treatment to enhancement is tempting to a lot of people. If we actually could manipulate the genome, couldn't we result in a better baby than what nature would have made possible? Okay, that sounds like it might be intriguing, but is it really a line we want to cross? And frankly, it is a discussion we've been having for decades, but until now, it's been pretty hypothetical, and now it is much more concrete. Human embryos have been edited already. They have not been reimplanted to try to create a baby. They've been destroyed after a few days, but the technology works. This is a way in which you can change the very instruction book of a human being. So where does that take us? Well, again, is there justification for this for a benevolent purpose, for prevention of disease? I would submit the specific examples are not very compelling. To use this, you would basically have to do in vitro fertilization. You would have to take the embryos that have been generated in IVF, and you'd have to do a DNA diagnosis on them to see which ones needed editing. In the process, you would identify some embryos that didn't need editing in almost every instance. So why not just reimplant those, which is something that's already done using pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So it is not so obvious why one needs this approach for medical purposes for prevention of disease. But what about enhancement? Why am I squirrely about this? Well, there are scientific concerns, there are safety concerns, there are huge philosophical and theological concerns, there are equity concerns. Who has access to this? And frankly, there are these problems about the boundaries. Where do you move from something that's medically considered to be a treatment or a prevention into something called an enhancement? And this is where I think many of us get snarled up. We think treatment's good, enhancement's bad. Can you always really decide which thing you're talking about? Look at my graph here. On the x-axis, the horizontal axis, is going to be whether something is acceptable or unacceptable, and sometimes even admirable. On the y-axis, the vertical axis, is how soon could we actually do this? So let's think of some things that might fit into this, is it enhancement or is it not, kind of category, and see where they fall on the plot. Now, these are my positions on the plot. You may disagree with them. Hair coloring, okay. That's an enhancement, people. Some of you have been enhanced in that regard in this room, I'm pretty sure. And that we would say is acceptable. Music lessons, that's not just acceptable, that's admirable. I benefited from those. That enhanced my brain function, I hope, some days more than others. Immunizations, that is a biological enhancement. When you get a vaccine, you're actually causing your immune cells to rearrange their DNA to be ready when they see that pathogen the next time it comes around. So yeah, that's an enhancement, but we think of that not just as a good thing, it's an admirable thing, and it's available now. I'm going to put prayer in here. We enhance ourselves and perhaps what happens in the world by exercising prayer. That's admirable and it's available now, and I would say you could call it an enhancement. Okay, going to the other side. Viagra, well, okay, it's available now, and I guess we consider it acceptable. Sometimes the thing we're talking about might be an enhancement in one situation and a treatment in the other. Ritalin for attention deficit disorder can be a great boon to kids who are otherwise having trouble in school. But for college students taking exams, well, that's an enhancement and probably one that's not so good for them, and so we'd say that's less acceptable. Drugs to treat morbid obesity. We are working on that, so I'm putting them in not be available now, but for morbid obesity people where this is a huge medical risk and maybe the only other alternative is surgery, that might be a good thing. But if you want to offer it to people who are, just wanting to indulge in order to stay thin, somehow that doesn't feel quite right. You see where I'm going with this? Enhancement is not so easy to put your finger on. Human-animal chimeras, I talked about that. If you're going to make a transplantable organ for somebody who needs a new heart, Well, okay, that seems like a good thing, but maybe it'd be better if we were making it without having to use that chimera. Build it in a dish, and we're starting to learn how to do that too. Gene editing to cure sickle cell disease. I've already said, gosh, this is great. We should do this. To cure thousands of other diseases of the rare sort, we should push forward on that too. But gene editing of human embryos to prevent disease, I'm not convinced right now that there's a reason to say we need to do that. And to enhance performance, I mean, like make a child who's a better athlete, a better musician, has a higher IQ. First of all, we don't know how to do that. Those are genes that are numerous and have small effects, and the environment is hugely important. Extension of lifespan, do we want to go there? That would be an enhancement. 120 years, we might succeed at that in another 10 or 15. To 500 years, I don't know. I'm going to put that one out there a ways. Downloading your consciousness to a computer, well, yeah, that was a different conversation when we had the neuroscience part. I'm going past that real quick. And then, yeah, my last one here, designer babies with precisely predictable outcomes. This is really important. As people get excited about, okay, we're going to enhance our future offspring by dialing in exactly the properties we want, it's going to be a miserable failure because all of the things you'd want to optimize for are controlled by very large numbers of genes, and the environment is probably a lot more important. And so those parents that thought they were getting the perfect kid are likely to get a sullen kid who doesn't want to talk to them because they forgot to be parents, you know? So yeah, a little sidelight here about why we have to think about enhancement a little bit more deeply before we say, well, we don't want to go there. But sometimes we don't want to go there. So how are we going to come to grips with this? The good news is that both believers and non-believers tend to agree about the basic framework of ethics that can guide us. It's unusual for me to be in a big discussion about bioethics and have a deep separation between the people who are both coming from a Judeo-Christian perspective overtly and those who are not, because we are all sharing those same views. Respect for persons, beneficence, that is, doing things to help people, and justice and equity. There are better ways to divide this up, but those are the basic fundamentals of what ethics is all about. But make no mistake, if we're really contemplating changing the human DNA in the germline, the consequences of this are profound. And I'm going to argue this is not a line that we should be crossing right now. I don't think the argument is convincing that we need to. And there's so many things we don't know about this. First of all, we don't know the safety risks. We say that CRISPR-Cas is so incredibly precise that it goes and changes that one letter and nothing else happens. It's pretty hard to be sure about that in a given circumstance. Maybe there's an occasional glitch somewhere else. Maybe your search and replace occasionally finds something that looks almost like the same thing and changes that too. Think about, in terms of autonomy, we have respect for persons. When you change the germline of that individual, all of their offspring and down through the generations are also, without their consent, having their biology altered as well. Is that ethical? And who decides what's an improvement? Think about that one really hard, because we've been down, remember eugenics? Remember, eugenics started in the United States. Look where that led us. Are we so advanced now that we could be confident that what we're calling an improvement is not just a reflection of our own prejudice? If germline editing actually turns out to provide benefits, who's going to have access? And will this lead to further separation between the haves and the have-nots? This will be highly technical. This could be an affront to justice and equity principles. And then finally, what does it mean to be human if that can be fundamentally altered by tinkering with our biological instruction book? How would this affect our relationship with the Creator? We are, as Genesis says, in the image of God. How does this affect what we read in the Psalms about our relationship with the Creator? Psalm 139, for you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. When I was woven together in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. Does gene editing fit with that? When we're talking about changing the very essence of human biology, the instruction book, the genome. All of us who are believers, and especially those who know these words as Christians, should think long and hard about whether that's a boundary that we're ready to cross over. I guess you could be somewhat reassured that the scientific community is paying attention to this. The National Academy of Sciences put out this report, Human Genome Editing, Science, Ethics, and Governance. They did open the door a crack towards germline editing for medical purposes, came up with a few, I think, reasonably far-fetched examples where that might make sense. But for the most part, for enhancement, they said, no, we don't want to go there. But in the absence of a consensus, and I wouldn't say we're at one right now, science has moved forward. Groups both in China and in the United States have done CRISPR-Cas editing of human embryos to show that it's possible to do so. They have not determined to try to create a baby, but they have shown that the first steps of that are in fact scientifically possible. Now, I have to say, I've probably at this point made you all pretty uneasy about, oh my God, we've got to figure out some way to stop this. And maybe we do need to pay a lot of attention to that. But I have to come back for one more minute before I stop with the reasons why we're doing this anyway, which is to try to come up with answers for terrible diseases. And I know no better example right now than this one. Spinal muscular atrophy is a disease that affects newborns. They appear normal at birth, but they're a little bit floppy. And as they grow through a few months, it's clear that their muscle tone is weaker and weaker. And as you can see from this picture, by the time they're 8 or 9 months old, they have no muscle tone at all. Their muscles are basically failing. Not because the muscles are affected, but because the nerves in the spinal cord, those motor neurons that innervate those muscles, are gradually dying. This is like ALS, except in a baby. It's actually a fairly common disease. And these babies never live more than about 12 to 14 months. They die of suffocation. It is one of the grimmest conditions. And up until now, we have had nothing to offer to these kids. Jerry Mendel at Nationwide Children's Hospital had mounted a program using a gene therapy approach to this, which seemed very high risk, but in a circumstance like this, one wants to try high-risk things. And with this, a single intravenous infusion of a genetic therapy, only so far in about a dozen kids, all of whom were identified shortly after birth, and then the treatment started right away. He has had truly dramatic results. And I'll show you just one quick video of one of those kids. Remember, these kids don't generally live past a year. They never learn to sit up. Well, here's Mateo. He's 2.5 years old. He's going to work today. Got to find the elevator here. Now, not only is he walking, he's standing on his tiptoes, something unbelievable for a kid with SMA. And then, a little later on, he and his dad go out to the gym, and there he is, hanging on the monkey bars. Mateo and his dad. That is the kind of thing that we have dreamed of and that is starting to happen, and which we want to happen, even as we carry with us the responsibility of being sure these technologies get used for that kind of outcome and not for something that we later regret. This is a somatic cell treatment. This does not affect the germline. So toward the future, what's the balance? How do we bring hope to those who are suffering? That's an ethical imperative. Jesus spent an awful lot of the time we know about healing people. I think we were supposed to notice that. Doing nothing would be the most unethical of the options. That's not something we can defend. So we have to proceed, but we have to proceed responsibly. Those long-standing ethical principles can help us form the cornerstone. International consensus would be a really good thing, but at the moment there is no international body that has the authority to arrive at that, which means we're kind of trying to do this informally, which worries me, because there's no enforcement behind those kinds of agreements that academics might come to. But people of faith have an important role to play. But we have to be well grounded in the science to come to a conversation on topics of this sort. Those who are believers need to be prepared both to defend the things that should go forward and also to raise the questions about those where questions need to be raised. I'm hopeful that conversations like this, in a place like this, can make it more possible for that kind of dialogue to happen. I think the BioLogos website is a great place for those things to happen, and I'm honored indeed to see the way in which that has developed over the years. This is the painting that hangs over my desk at NIH, and I look at several times a day. This is Jacob's Ladder, in case you're wondering what that might be. So painted by a nonagenarian artist at James Madison who just sent me a picture of it saying, I think this might be for you. And there it is. And yes, that's Jacob. We all worship the God of Jacob. Jacob, in this case, appearing to wrestle, but maybe also to climb on that ladder. We have this opportunity more than we ever had in our history to try to do the right thing in this space. But we need to do so thoughtfully. As I was preparing this lecture, I took out a book I haven't read in a little while. It was C.S. Lewis. It was The Abolition of Man. And it's a little chilling. He wrote this book in the context of the Nazi eugenics horror and points out sort of what it means to try to change our very essence. If any one age really attains, by eugenics and scientific education, the power to make its descendants what it pleases. Does that sound like gene editing of embryos? All men who live after it are the patients of that power. They are weaker, not stronger. For though we may have put wonderful machines in their hands, we have preordained how they are to use them. Once again, Jack Lewis, in a very artful and somewhat visionary statement, warning us what we ought to be thinking about. So with that, I hope all of us in this conversation this evening and in other opportunities can both celebrate the advances, which are breathtaking and have so much promise to give hope to families who are desperate for those answers, but also figure out how it is that we, as children of God, need to take that responsibility with the greatest seriousness and respect that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and we might want to think very hard about remaking ourselves in that way. Thank you very much.
How would you like to follow Francis Collins? It's a humbling honor to be part of the conversation. Thank you so much. I'm a terrible interlocutor because I'm just here as a student, overwhelmingly learning along with you. So let me, and I don't disagree about anything. So we'll have to find something to fight about. But let me just start then by affirming and deepening and just adding to the chorus of Dr. Collins' championing of Christian investment and involvement in the natural sciences and this kind of technological development. I think some of us who come from spaces forget that there are Christians who struggle to still imagine that these things go together. And so I think this is such a crucial word to affirm, that this kind of attention to the natural world, to our bodies, to our environments, is actually one of the ways that we enact the image of God. Like, that's how we live out imaging God, is by attending to his world. And it's surely one of the scandals of being created in God's image is that he has actually commissioned us and deputized us to understand and unfold and steward this good but broken world. And some of the most significant ways that we do that is through the sciences. Some of the most significant ways that we care for the vulnerable is precisely through the work of the sciences and the technologies that grow out of that. If you think of the history of how we improved caloric intake over the past century and a half so that we can deal with hunger, it's because of scientific development. I was thinking as Francis was speaking, sometimes the Lord who heals with mud and spittle also heals because he commissions people like Francis Collins to study the human genome. It's the same Spirit who's doing the same work of healing, and we should be enthusiastically involved in both of those things. So let's talk about something that becomes interesting then. I want to pick up on the gene editing conversation and thinking through some of the implications of this. And I want to think through both the opportunities and cautions. And again, I think amplifying and extending and thinking alongside Dr. Collins. So let's start with an opportunity. As Francis pointed out, this possibility of editing human embryos raises really fundamental questions of what it means to be human. And as he also suggested, that is not a question that actually natural science can answer. And so what happens is we recognize this limit on any sort of technocratic hubris that we might be tempted by. Our technological prowess raises questions that technology itself can't answer. It draws on and it assumes those answers from elsewhere. For some reason, I always think of that scene from Top Gun, where, which tells you a little bit about sort of my high school career. But do you remember when the commander takes Maverick and he says, "Son, your ego's writing checks your body can't cash." And I just think we have to realize this conversation that we're inserted in tonight is at that liminal space between the incredible capacities and possibilities of what science and technology affords, and yet bringing us to the frontier of questions that it can't answer. So the question is, what story do we believe about what it means to be human? This is actually where I see the opportunity, even if sometimes the opportunity presents itself as a threat. Let me try to explain. I think for generations now, our society has been sort of trying on new answers to that fundamental question of what it means to be human. You might say that we've been editing our own identity and re-narrating human nature in important ways. And many of these have been reductionistic, reducing us to either copulating pieces of meat or selfish cognitive biomachines or these islands of autonomous self-interest. But when we start to actually tease out the implications of understanding ourselves in those flattened, reductionistic ways, I think Francis is right. I actually think a lot of people, many people, have severe hesitations at that point. And while there might be influential Silicon Valley elites who are trying to write over centuries of understandings of human nature, I actually think that there is a cringe and a pause from many people as they hear the narrative spun out further. So I was playing with the editing metaphor, and I wonder if we could think about human nature as a palimpsest. Do you know what So a palimpsest is, in ancient times when they didn't have paper, and scrolls were made of vellum and different kinds of skin and things like that. It was incredibly valuable. So you would write one manuscript, and then when you felt like you were done with that, you would try to sort of scrub it, and you would actually write over with your new manuscript over the palimpsest. But if we think about human nature as this palimpsest, what it means is there might be all of these attempts to sort of scrub it and edit it, and yet there's something about us made in God's image that keeps bleeding through, that pushes back on those kinds of attempts. This is where I believe that religious voices have an opportunity to contribute to our public understanding, even if it might sometimes seem like the environment is hostile to hearing those voices. I don't let a minority report from the op-ed pages of certain papers that's not always a sample representation of actually what a society is longing to hear. I think that we can offer wisdom to a society that is drowning in information precisely because we have a rich, complex story to tell about what human beings are, who we are, and whose we are, and we can embody that. It's exactly what Dr. Collins' work does, embodies the rich complexity of that story. Now, I'm sorry, I just have to say, we don't get the right to bear witness and testify to this rich story about what human beings are if we are willing to basically trade their dignity for political power. So I absolutely think we need to speak up for human dignity and how integral that is to the human person, and therefore we need to realize that you can't treat that lightly as if it's a pawn you can use in political negotiation. But I digress. What I'm suggesting is we actually need to speak publicly from the specificity of our religious understandings. And I'm saying religious understandings here a little bit generically here because I actually think on these matters, Jews, Christians, and Muslims share so much in common about what we can testify to about the historic understanding of human nature. And so for us to speak out of the thickness and particularity of the biblical narrative and offer society a story of who we are as human beings, what it means to be made in the image of God, you might be surprised actually how much openness there is to hearing the specificity of that story. By the way, I want to make one plug there's a journal called The New Atlantis, published by the Ethics and Public Policy Center here in DC. To me, The New Atlantis is actually the space where this kind of rich conversation is happening. And so if you're intrigued, follow up on that. So what does the biblical story have to say then about what it means to be human? Well, of course, it is a story of unconditional dignity. That human beings are valued not because of what they can do, and even not only because they are made by God, but actually because they are loved by God. But we also need to see it as an account of our creatureliness. And I think we sometimes underestimate the significance of this, that the biblical story about being human is a story about creatureliness, that our finitude is a gift, precisely because it makes us dependent. That is, and I realize this will sound scandalous in a society that has come to prize autonomy and independence above everything else, but I actually think there are signs that story about being human is wearing out. That story is not paying off and isn't working, and we might be surprised how much our neighbors are open to hearing a different account of our creatureliness. Now, here I want to try to articulate something very, very carefully, and in a way probably shouldn't bite this off in a short time, but let me put it this way. If human dignity stems from being loved by God, and our humanity manifests itself in this dependence, then that means relations of dependence are at the very heart of being human. Does that seem like a fair conclusion to draw? Okay. So this entails, I think, maybe a difficult truth, and I'm even worried about how to articulate this, but I wonder if it means that we actually have to say that suffering is sometimes how we learn to be dependent. That is, I do think there's something about the biblical story of what human beings are that also will push us to ask really, really hard questions about suffering, not because we want to romanticize it, but because that it is a way that we learn to be dependent, and it's part of what calls us to care. Of course, absolutely, we are called to alleviate and respond to suffering. That is absolutely part of our calling. But that is different than trying to eliminate it, it seems to me. Indeed, too often, our desires to eliminate suffering is a manifestation of our desire to not be needy or to not be needed. In other words, it's us pushing back against this dependency, our creatureliness. And even more frightening, I think, too often the desire to eliminate suffering becomes a project of eliminating needy people. So what we construe as disabilities, for example, too often simply reflect the world that we've made that won't accommodate those who are suffering. It's not just a question of who gets to decide what counts as a disability, which is a huge question. It's not just a matter of who gets to decide what is editable about human nature, huge question. It's also a question of whether we would be less human without our neediness and dependence and care. This makes me think of Don DeLillo's most recent novel, 0K, which is, has anybody read 0K? Oh, okay. I commend it to you. It's actually really, really relevant to the conversation that we're having tonight. The first line of the book is jarringly direct. Everybody wants to own the end of the world. Everybody wants to own the end of the world. And the story that unfolds in the novel is actually one of technological hubris, where you get this naturalistic kind of Silicon Valley-ish quest for immortality on our terms as a feat of our scientific achievement. DeLillo's skepticism and caution in the telling of this tale, I think, is actually a testimony to the opening and opportunity that I was talking about. So Don DeLillo is not a religious writer by any stretch, but the very fact of how he tells this story of the sort of human scientific quest for immortality in our terms is, to me, a manifestation of a cultural openness that has some pause and caution and openness. In fact, what's striking is how often DeLillo, the novelist, has to resort to religious language and religious conceptuality to try to make sense of what's at issue here. But there's a curious coda at the end of the novel, very end of the novel. I'm not going to ruin the story for you, but after sort of all the action has taken place, the narrator is on a bus in Midtown Manhattan. And the timing and angle of the bus is such, just right, that in this sort of fjord of Midtown skyscrapers has become a cinema for a phenomenon that happens only once or twice a year, where the sun's rays align perfectly with the local street grid. He hears a wail of glee and fascination, and he turns to see a boy looking at the sun enraptured, and he describes the scene this way. I left my seat and went to stand nearby. His hands were curled at his chest, half fists, soft and trembling. His mother sat quietly, watching with him. The boy bounced slightly in accord with the cries, and they were unceasing and also exhilarating. They were pre-linguistic grunts. I hated to think that he was impaired in some way, macrocephalic, mentally deficient. But these howls of awe were far more suitable than words. Friends, what would we lose if we edited that boy out of existence? In what way is he actually the palimpsest of what we were made for, a testimony of our nature as creatures made to worship, to delight in awe, to care and be cared for, and to be loved by a God with scars? Thanks very much.
We're in a little bit of a dilemma right here in that we are already over time, but it is not possible to leave without at least some questions from the audience, always the most dynamic part of our evening. So those of you who have been here before know that we have 3 guidelines for questions. We ask that you be brief, and this is particularly important tonight. All questions be civil, and we ask that all questions be in the form of a question. So we will take a few brief questions from the audience. We'll ask for brief answers and just have a Q&A blitzkrieg. Please wait for the microphone to come. Some questions right over here. Is there a microphone right over here?
I was just wondering about the possibilities of gene editing or what you're looking at in terms of mental illness. I know schizophrenia they found a few genes for that, but I don't know really where they are in that process.
Schizophrenia is one of those very complex genetic disorders where there clearly are factors in DNA that contribute to it. The last count is 92 different places in the genome where if you had a T instead of an A, it increases the risk by just a little bit. But there's still a lot of missing heritability that we haven't discovered yet. And it's also clear that there are other influences that are not genetic. The usual way we assess that is by looking at identical twins who have the same DNA, and they're not always concordant for schizophrenia. So we have a lot to learn in that space. I would say as a target for gene editing, this would be a long way off because we wouldn't have a very good idea about exactly what edit to make. It would certainly be a circumstance where for that individual, you'd need to deliver the apparatus to the organ that's affected, which is the brain, which is something we don't know how to do yet. So we're decades maybe away from that kind of an outcome, but I wouldn't say it's impossible.
Other questions from the audience? Right in the back there. Back row.
Sure. There was a lot of sort of anchoring in older philosophies, modalities, and things like that. I was wondering, and hence you're seeing like this upcoming cliff coming up. I wonder if you could maybe speak to the natural tendency we have as humans to adapt ourselves to new circumstances, and that those things would just be increasingly slide away, and everything we're raising an alarm for now, 50 years from now, no big deal. No, why were they worried about that?
Yeah, good question. What about the cringe factor? Does the cringe factor have a half-life that ultimately means it's not a cringe anymore?
That's a great question. Doesn't it seem though like we're entertaining qualitative leaps rather than quantitative adaptations at this? Or is that what we always say in retrospect, right? Like it always looked like a qualitative leap beforehand.
People always talk about in vitro fertilization because that seemed very qualitative, and yet now it's like, oh, big deal.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think a big part of the question is how much are we collectively trying to discern what the good is as we're approaching that? And I'm not sure. I was really intrigued by your point that we don't seem to have very good mechanisms to think about this globally, intentionally in that regard. And that's worrisome, right?
It is worrisome.
Other questions? Front row here.
Microphone?
In the journey of everything, where does dark matter and dark energy factor in here as a wild card in the CERN project?
You're asking the biologist to
There's an
explain?
astronomer you need to find afterwards.
Let's just say it's really interesting, and there's a mystery there waiting to be resolved. I'm not going to be the one to resolve it. Maybe Deb Harsma will, or her colleagues. There's fundamental things about the universe that are still outside of our knowledge, and discovering those will be another amazing moment of a glimpse of the Creator's mind.
Take other questions right there in the middle. If you could stand up, it'll make it easier for you to be seen.
Thank you. First of all, Dr. Collins, I want to thank you. My mother had stage 4 urethral cancer. She was told to get her affairs in order. And now she's doing immunotherapy, and the cancer can't be found anymore. So thank you for your work.
Thank you.
But because Cherie gives the instructions, I'm going to ask you a question as well. but you talked about reluctance to use CRISPR to do things that affect the germline. How about people who are like fragile X carriers? So you want to, repair their X so their germline could be healthier. What's your view on that?
So, yeah, we could walk through that. So Fragile X is an inherited form of learning disability affecting boys because it's on the X chromosome. Boys have one X and one Y, and so if the X is affected, that's the only one they've got. Mothers, sometimes, of boys are carriers. They have one X that's okay and one that has this alteration on it. So you might say, why don't you then go in and edit that glitch out of there? But how would you do it? Again, you'd have to do an in vitro fertilization. You would have then a bunch of embryos that got formed by the sperm and the egg of the parents coming together. You would want to know which of those are actually going to be affected males, and it would be half of the males that would have this and half that would not. By the time you've done all that, you would know which embryos are not going to be affected because you've already done the DNA diagnosis. The straightforward thing to do at that point, because you can't reimplant all the embryos without leading to a multiple pregnancy, which will result in a terrible disaster, just reimplant the ones that aren't affected. So gene editing theoretically could be a solution, but practically it wouldn't be necessary to do something so elaborate when you have a simple solution right in front of you.
question right here on the second row. You can just stand so it's easier to be seen by the guy with the microphone. Go ahead.
Stand up.
Thank you very much. I'm from France, and I moved to the United States. 2 questions. First of all, thank you so much. It's quite enlightening. If we take from Christian perspective to reconcile with science, lately in Germany in particular, I'm aware of studies regarding the impact of fasting, Christian practice, on immunology, or I'm sure you know much better. That angle seems to be of interest, and we don't need to ask the question when we can reconcile the practice of fasting has a positive impact on health. And my second question, would you advise a package of what you said about to disseminate it for high school, or in particular in libraries, to make it available out of school, after school, so that they can explore. I'm with UNESCO, and I think I could convince to disseminate that knowledge, not from antagonist perspective, but just to immerse students, families. So, thank you.
And the first part of the question, I didn't get one word, which you were asking about, which was?
Was it fasting?
Fasting. Okay, thank you. That was a critical part of the question. There is a lot of interest right now in whether fasting, occasional fasting, would not only be beneficial for one's spiritual life, and I think there's lots of arguments in favor of that, but maybe also good for physical health. And there are certainly strong advocates of that, and we at NIH are actually running a few studies to try to see what might be the benefits in terms of what happens with such things as your blood pressure or your cholesterol, and maybe we'll get some more rigorous data. Right now it's a bit more on the anecdotal side. In terms of education, we are really hoping that the enormous excitement of science right now is something that young people hear about and decide that's what they want to work on, because the next generation is going to be critical for making a lot of these great things come true. These days, most young people find their information on the internet, and so that's where we try to make sure this kind of thing can be readily found. I will give a slight plug for the NIH website, which is the most heavily traveled website in the United States for health information, but also has a lot of science education. So I hope it is getting looked at. And of course, they could join my Twitter feed, and then they would have stuff to look at several times a day.
Jamie, anything to add?
No.
No? Okay. We'll take the last question right there.
Thank you. So I think there are many areas in which Christians view imaging God as a positive thing, be that caring for the poor or understanding the natural world or creating great art. So I'm curious why, in the realm of biotechnology, playing God becomes such a negative, scary thing.
Yes. So it's interesting. There's a difference between imaging God and being God. And so we are to reflect, we are to love what God loves and to pursue those things. I think the hesitancy, of course, is that hinges on the creator-creature distinction, and precisely the fact that I am not holy, right? I do not have perfect knowledge. I do not have perfect power. I certainly do not have perfect goodness. And therefore, even though the remarkable thing is how much, in a way, in the order of creation, God has deputized to us, and in a way unleashed us to do. But we do that with a high degree of awareness, or we ought to, that we are not God. And so there's a sense in which we are dependent on His word, His revelation, what we are learning from Him. And we need to, I think one of the real dangers of part of our secularization is that we actually forget our finitude, and we forget our limits. And that's when people should be most nervous when I think I know exactly what you need, right? And there's just it's why communal labor is actually such a huge check and balance, right? So that if we are collaborating, then there's sort of a dependency that's worked out there. I don't know, does that?
If we played God the way that God does, with perfect love and compassion and a sense of consequences and taking full account of those, then this would not be so scary. But history teaches us that we have not been so good in that regard. We are fallen creatures. Was it Chesterton who said the one Christian doctrine that can be proven by daily experience is universal sin?
Yes, yes. That's why I'm a Calvinist.
Well, thank you for that. And so, so yeah, I think when people say playing God, it is out of that realization that we are not God, and we have fallen short every time we've tried to pretend that we had that kind of benevolence, because we always end up being self-interested.
And on that note, Francis, Jamie, thank you.
Thank you.
So I am betting there are a lot of questions left in your mind. Clearly, there is a lot left to discuss, and happily, there is opportunity to do so. So Deb, if you could come on up and tell everyone a little bit about the opportunity to continue the discussion, that would be great.
Thank you, Cherie. My name is Deborah Tepley, and I'm the Executive Director at Church of the Advent. And on behalf of Church of the Advent, I'm delighted to be here partnering with the Trinity Forum and BioLogos and the Templeton Religion Trust to partner on hosting this event. Church of the Advent is an Anglican church here in Washington, D.C. We have 2 parish communities, one that meets in Northeast D.C. in Brooklyn on Sunday mornings at 10:30, one that meets at Columbia Heights in the Northwest Quadrant at 5 p.m. on Sunday evening. So if you're new to D.C. or looking for a church, we'd love to see you there and love to have you visit. Our desire as a church is to be a church that is seeking the flourishing of Washington, D.C. by building gospel-centered communities that practice generous hospitality and spiritual formation and missionary faithfulness in every neighborhood. And one of our ways of pursuing missionary faithfulness is by partnering in events like this with the Trinity Forum. We began this relationship back in 2011 when we received a grant from Scientists and Congregations, and that was funded generously by the John Templeton Foundation. And at that time, we hosted 3 events like this, bringing together scientists and non-scientists, just people that were interested in the sciences, to discuss issues related to science and faith, and bringing in theologians and scientists and philosophers. And as part of that, we also hosted follow-on dinners where people could, in a more intimate setting, discuss kind of the implications and questions that arose from these talks. And so once again, we're going to be hosting a follow-on dinner discussion that will be on Monday, July 16th. And so we'd love for you to come to that. You may ask now, why is Church of the Advent here and why are we engaged in this kind of discussion? Well, we initially applied for the grant back in 2011 because we had a number of parishioners, some of them were scientists, some of them not scientists, who had a deeply held interest in the sciences. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, but we understood that there was this perception that there's this divide between the world of science and the world of faith. And we believe, of course, that science actually is really our impulse to understand the good world that God created. And we wanted to provide a place where we could bring together people to talk about science and faith and to realize that there doesn't need to be a conflict between those two things. And so we wanted to provide an environment where scientists could discuss their faith in kind of an intelligent way, and also those of us who are decidedly not scientists could get over our fear that maybe if we were to discuss the complexities of cosmology and neuroscience and genetics and evolution, that we would lose our faith in the process. And so these conversations are really important, and this follow-on discussion will also be a great opportunity to continue to talk about the issues and things that were raised tonight. So if you would like to come to this dinner, it's free of charge, so we ask that you RSVP. We'll provide dinner and dessert and drinks, and we'll have our pastor, Dan Bielman, will be leading that conversation with some of our parishioners. You can sign up at this table right over here on your way out, or you can also go to our website, Church of the Advent, or the website of the Trinity Forum, and we hope to see you there.
Thank you, Deb, for that. And as we wrap up this evening, I'm going to ask you to turn your attention from contemplation of the mysteries of the universe to the invitation on each of your chairs, which is to join the Trinity Forum Society. Your membership in the Trinity Forum Society is what helps make evenings like this possible. We have been building a community in DC, across the nation, even across the world, of people who are interested in wrestling together with the great questions of life in a way that is both intellectually rigorous, warmly hospitable, and grounded in faith. There are very few other opportunities to do this in the same way. We sincerely hope that you will accept our invitation, become a member of the Trinity Forum Society. Of course, there are benefits when you do so. Among the benefits are our quarterly readings, where we take examples of the best literature and letters and human civilization. We add an introduction explaining context and background, discussion questions in the back, so that it is essentially a book club in a bag, along with our monthly podcast, our daily What We're Reading curated feeds. And as a special bonus for the first 10 people who join tonight, you will get a special collection of readings, including The Birthmark, which, as a bit of background, was actually the first story that the head of the President's Commission on Bioethics asked all the commissioners to read as a way of framing and grounding the discussion on bioethics. It's actually a short story by Nathaniel Hawthorne, but raises the big questions of life and helps one grapple with their application. So my colleagues, Colleen O'Malley, Alyssa Abraham, if you could just hold up your hands. They are great people to contact if you have any questions about becoming members of the Trinity Forum Society. They would love to help you out with that. We do have a table right in the back. Margaret and Drew, if you could raise your hand, that is a great place to sign up to become a member of the Trinity Forum Society, as well as to check out our various readings. Would also just want to let everybody know we will have pictures up on our Facebook page as well as on Twitter. Tag your friends, share tonight. As you can imagine, a fascinating discussion that we'd love to share with others as well. We also hope that you will join us for future evening conversations. Tonight is actually the final event in this series on discovery and doxology that was generously underwritten by the Templeton Religion Trust. If you happen to be someone who is interested in this series continuing, please let me know, let Colleen know. We would love to talk to you about keeping these discussions alive. Finally, as we wrap up, it is always appropriate to end in thanks. And as you might imagine, an evening like this does not happen without many people to thank. So we'd like to thank again our sponsor, the Templeton Religion Trust, for their generous support, the additional support that we received from the Murdoch Trust, our excellent partners, BioLogos, with Deb Harzma, and Church of the Advent, led by Rector Tommy Henson. Also would like to thank BioLogos staff, Luke Tooley, and Church of the Advent staff, Liz Downey, for their help, along with our uber-talented photographer, Clay Blackmore, most valuable volunteer, Hannah Wolf, our rock star interns, Renee Cooprider, Houston Wilson, Drew Howlett, and Margaret Whitworth, along with my fantastic colleagues, Colleen O'Malley, Rebecca Noyes, and Alyssa Abraham. Finally, thank you again to our incredible speakers, Francis Collins and Jamie Smith. To all of you for coming, and good night.